His skin blistered, burst, and peeled away in layers as he thrashed in the cauldron. On April 15, 1532, Richard Roose was publicly executed by being boiled alive at Smithfield in London. Iron chains held his limbs in place as he was repeatedly lowered into, and raised from, a large vat of scalding water. Eyewitnesses reported the process lasted up to 2 hours before his body finally went still. Roose had been a cook in the household of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester. In February 1531, a dish of porridge he prepared, intended for the bishop's staff, was laced with a white powder. 2 people died, one a household servant, the other a poor woman who had begged for food. Several others became violently ill. Roose claimed he had been given the substance by a stranger and believed it was only a purgative, not poison. He was arrested and interrogated at the Tower of London. Henry VIII took personal interest. Instead of a trial, Parliament passed a new statute. Poisoning would now be treated as high treason, punishable by death through boiling. Roose became its first and only recorded victim. How did a household cook end up as a national warning? Richard Roose was born in England sometime in the late 15th century. His exact birth year, location, and parentage are not documented. He was not of noble blood. All surviving records suggest he came from the lower classes, ordinary men who found work where they could, often in service roles. Roose's path took him into domestic employment, eventually working as a cook. By the early 1530s, Roose was employed in the London household of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester. Fisher was a senior Catholic cleric, well regarded for his piety and education, and later executed himself for opposing Henry VIII's religious reforms. Roose's position in Fisher's household would have placed him near one of the kingdom's most politically sensitive churchmen. Cooks in Tudor England occupied a curious status, vital but invisible. They prepared food for noble households, monasteries, and courts, often without recognition, unless something went wrong. The role demanded trust. Poisoning fears had long existed in elite circles, especially when religion and politics overlapped. There are no records of Roose displaying violence or disloyalty prior to 1531. His background gives no indication of a man likely to enter historical record. He was unremarkable in every known way. No records of family, marriage, children, or property survive. In this, he resembled many others who lived and died without notice during Henry VIII's reign. What made him different was not his life, but the moment he became entangled in royal justice, public fear, and legal precedent. He was not born for history, he stumbled into it. But this early ordinariness would soon give way to violence, secrecy, and political attention from the highest level of English power. There is no record of Richard Roose receiving any formal education. Like most lower-class men in early 1600s England, he likely learned by doing from observation, repetition, and labor. His trade as a cook would have been learned through apprenticeship, probably beginning in adolescence. This kind of training focused on service, not status. Cooks had no platform to express opinions, political or otherwise. He lived in a world deeply shaped by hierarchy, obedience, and fear of authority, both divine and royal. England under Henry VIII was a realm of rigid control. The church dominated thought, the monarchy controlled law, and all classes were subject to swift punishment if they stepped out of line. In this climate, the role of a cook came with practical risk. Rumors of poisoning circulated often. Kitchens were watched more closely in political households. By the 20s and 30s of the 1600s, anxiety over food tampering increased. Public executions for food-related cremesling spoiled meat, for example, not unheard of. Cooked meals for nobility were guarded carefully. The Tudor court itself had food tasters. Richard Roose had no known associations with court factions, criminal groups, or religious dissenters, but he worked in the household of John Fisher, outspoken critic of Henry VIII's efforts to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and break from the Catholic Church. Fisher's resistance made him a target for royal suspicion. To work in that environment knowingly or not was to stand on dangerous ground. Roose's confession stated he had been approached by a stranger who gave him a powder and told him to put it in the porridge as a joke. He claimed he believed it was a laxative. Whether this is true remains unknown. Under Tudor law, torture could be used to extract confessions. Roose was held in the Tower of London, where he may have faced physical coercion. He was not driven by ideology, but he lived in a system that turned even accidents into acts of treason. Once the porridge was poisoned and 2 people died, Roose's fate no longer rested in the facts. It belonged to the king. Soon, those ideas would be put to the test, not in theory, but in power. Richard Roose never held power, but his case became a vehicle for royal authority. What followed was not his rise, but Henry VIII's. Shortly after the poisonings at Bishop Fisher's household, Roose was arrested and sent to the Tower of London. In ordinary cases of murder or manslaughter, English common law required a trial by jury. Roose, however, was never tried in court. His case was removed from legal norms and placed directly under the king's attention. Henry VIII saw an opportunity. In March 1531, less than a month after the incident, Parliament passed a new statute titled An Act for Poisoning, 22 Henry VIII, Chapter 9. It declared that poisoning was no longer just murder, it was now high treason. The punishment was specific: boiling alive. This new law applied retroactively and was written with Roose's act in mind. This decision marked a rare instance where Parliament bypassed due process entirely. Roose was condemned by statute, not trial. The law stripped him of benefit of clergy, meaning no priestly protection. There was no formal defense, no evidence presented beyond his confession. The shift was deliberate. By transforming an act of alleged individual malice into an offense against the realm, Henry reinforced his control over criminal justice. Poisoning was no longer a private crime. It was treason, an attack on the stability of the kingdom itself. Roose, unnamed in the statute but clearly its target, became the symbolic figurehead of this change. He had no voice. His crime, motive, or intent no longer mattered. What mattered was the message. The law passed without resistance. Parliament supported the move. There was no legal appeal. On April 15, 1532, at Smithfield, London, Henry's new justice was enacted in full view of the public. Roose was boiled alive under orders of the king. This was not about one cook. It was about absolute power. And what happened when royal will replace legal process? Now in power, Henry VIII began turning belief into law, and law into control. The execution of Richard Roose came during one of the most volatile periods in Henry VIII's reign. By 1532, England was approaching a constitutional and spiritual rupture. The king was locked in conflict with the Catholic Church, determined to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope refused. Tensions escalated. The Reformation loomed. In this climate, the Roose case became more than punishment. It became precedent. By using Parliament to create a retroactive law targeting a single individual, Henry had set a dangerous model. Justice could now be redefined at will. The legal protections that once separated nobles from commoners, clergy from laymen, were collapsing. The Poisoning Act gave the king a new weapon. Treason law, once focused on rebellion or conspiracy, now reached into domestic crimes. For the first time, execution by boiling was sanctioned as an official penalty. It bypassed ecclesiastical courts and gave no space for pardon. Critics did exist. Sir Thomas More, then Lord Chancellor, is believed to have disapproved of the act, but open opposition to Henry's authority was growing riskier. Many who dissented, like Bishop Fisher himself, would later face execution for defying the king. The method of death was part of the message. Hanging, the usual penalty for murder, was hidden behind prison walls. Boiling was public, theatrical, and slow. It provoked horror and reinforced fear. For Henry, it served dual purposes: to punish and to warn. Yet the law's immediate expansion also revealed instability. If the king could create treason from kitchen accidents, what else could be redefined? Loyalists and enemies alike began to understand that royal favor not law now determined fate. Though Roose had no heirs, his case altered the inheritance of English justice. The monarchy began taking more direct control over criminal proceedings, undermining centuries of legal tradition. Common law shrank, statute law grew. Parliamentary silence signaled approval, at least submission. Roose's boiling marked a pivot point. It was not the last harsh measure Henry would impose, but it was the first to claim ordinary service as an existential threat. From then on, every kitchen, every servant, every private act could be seen as political. Richard Roose was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol of what happened when royal fear met absolute authority. Now, those ideas were becoming systems of control. The execution of Richard Roose marked the opening phase of a new system of punishment tone, where the king's word could restructure justice without precedent or review. What followed over the next 10 years was a steady escalation in cruelty, centralization, and surveillance. Under Henry VIII's reign, new institutions of repression were developed or empowered. The Court of Star Chamber, once a tool for managing noble disputes, became a mechanism for suppressing dissent. The Privy Council expanded in function, often issuing decrees directly from the Crown. Parliament passed acts targeting ideological enemies, Protestants, Catholics, and political opponents alike. Laws were shaped not by consensus, but by loyalty to the monarch. The same Parliament that had legalized boiling alive also passed the Acts of Attainder, which allowed people to be declared guilty without trial. These acts were often used to eliminate rivals or disobedient servants. Records show that dozens of people, noble and common alike, were executed through attainder alone. Religious enforcement intensified. In the wake of the break with Rome, Henry established the supreme headship of the Church of England, requiring all subjects to recognize him, not the Pope, as the final religious authority. Refusal was punishable by death. Thomas More and John Fisher were both executed by beheading in 1535 for defying this. Meanwhile, new laws enabled brutal executions. Burning at the stake was used for heresy. Hanging, drawing, and quartering remained the penalty for treason. Boiling, though rarely used after Roose, remained on the books until 1547. In each case, the punishment was public, slow, and deliberately painful. The machinery of fear spread into the daily lives of ordinary citizens. Public loyalty oaths became routine. Surveillance increased. Informers were rewarded. Even casual remarks about the king or religion could result in imprisonment or worse. Roose's case had revealed how a single event could justify broad legal transformation. The king had shown he could bypass normal judicial procedures to impose a new order, and no one had stopped him. By the late 1530s, fear was institutionalized. The dissolution of the monasteries eliminated centuries-old religious communities, their wealth seized and their members dispersed. Resistance, armed or verbal, was met with crushing retaliation. In 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive uprising in the north of England, was suppressed. Hundreds were executed. Richard Roose had poisoned one dish, but Henry's response had poisoned the law itself, turning it into an instrument of terror and obedience. Even individuals close to Henry were targeted by these systems. As the machinery of punishment expanded, Henry VIII's personal relationships grew increasingly fragile. Trust collapsed, alliances fractured, and paranoia deepened. The king, once celebrated for charm and charisma, now ruled through fear, even among those closest to him. The same parliament that enabled the execution of Richard Roose also gave Henry tools to purge his inner circle. Former confidants, wives, ministers, and family members would soon face imprisonment, trial, or death. Henry no longer tolerated opposition, not even hesitation. The first major break came in 1536. Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, and once the center of his obsession, was arrested, tried, and executed on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Her brother and several courtiers were executed with her. The evidence was flimsy. The message was clear: no one was untouchable. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of many of Henry's legal reforms, suffered a similar fate. After orchestrating the king's fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves, Cromwell fell from favour. He was arrested in 1540, attainted without trial, and executed. Cromwell had helped design the very tools that sealed his end. Friends turned informers. Servants disappeared. Loyalty could not be provenonally assumed until revoked. Letters reveal growing caution in courtly speech. Private conversations were avoided. Even noblemen whispered only in trusted company, if at all. Henry's own daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were declared illegitimate in official documents at various points, depending on the king's marital politics. His son Edward was closely guarded, surrounded by handlers chosen for loyalty, not kinship. The use of informants increased. Political arrests often began with vague accusations. In the absence of open resistance, paranoia filled the void. People were punished for imagined threats, for proximity to fallen figures, or for private conversations overheard by servants. The legal precedent set in the Roose case that due process could be circumvented when the king deemed it necessary became the model, not the exception. Boiling was rare, but beheading and burning became routine. Each death widened the distance between the king and his court. By the early 1540s, Henry had begun removing people not only for opposition, but for independence of thought. Silence was safer than closeness. Presence became a liability. Loyalty was no longer a shield. The crown was now surrounded by silence and fear. The king trusted no one, and no one trusted the king. Signs of strain in leadership and personal stability were now evident. By the 1540s, Henry VIII's physical deterioration was unmistakable. Once athletic and commanding, he now struggled with immobility, chronic pain, and increasing dependence on others. His decline was visible, and so was its effect on his behavior. A serious jousting accident in January 1536 left Henry with a deep leg wound. It never healed properly. Over time, it developed into an ulcer, leaking pus and requiring daily draining. Physicians packed it with herbs, honey, and cloth, but the infection persisted. The king grew obese, reaching over 300 pounds, and required mechanical devices to move. He could no longer ride, hunt, or walk without assistance. As his body failed, his temper sharpened. Observers noted unpredictable outbursts, rages, and extreme suspicion. He lashed out at courtiers and advisors, reversing policies and shifting alliances. Some historians describe this period as marked by paranoia and cognitive decline. Formal diagnoses are speculative, but contemporary reports speak of forgetfulness, volatility, and erratic decision-making. Henry's appearance changed dramatically. His once handsome features gave way to bloated skin, red eyes, and a grey pallor. He wore heavily padded garments to conceal weight and bandages. Few approached him without anxiety. Access to the king became increasingly limited, filtered through a shrinking circle of attendants and guards. His emotional world narrowed. He expressed increasing fear of betrayal and divine punishment. He relied on omens, dreams, and selective scriptural readings. Religious paranoia intensified. Heresy, treason, and disobedience became indistinguishable in his eyes. New executions were ordered, even when counsel advised mercy. In 1546, Henry approved the burning of Anne Askew, a noblewoman tortured and executed for Protestant beliefs, despite her connections at court. The once confident monarch now feared shadows within his own palace. He moved less, he spoke less, but he commanded with greater finality. Physicians dared not contradict him. Records from court doctors show a shift from treatment to appeasement. His orders overrode medical advice. When pain overwhelmed him, he demanded stronger remedies. Sometimes opiates, sometimes isolation. His leg ulcers worsened. The stench was noted in court records. Rooms had to be specially aired before he could enter. Visitors often stood at a distance, partly from protocol, partly from revulsion. His signature, once bold, grew shaky and sparse. Others increasingly signed on his behalf, but he remained king. He issued laws, named successors, and ordered deaths. No one removed him. No one could. Despite worsening health, Henry retained control over key decisions. Until the end, his word remained law. Each new pain echoed a past cruelty, and the body that had once made kingship seem divine, now made mortality unavoidable. In the final months of his life, Henry VIII ruled from his bed. His body was failing, but his authority remained intact. Decisions still flowed from his chambers, some political, some personal, and some vengeful. He was mostly confined to rooms at Whitehall Palace. Servants, physicians, and clerks attended to him under strict supervision. Few saw him directly. Access required permission from trusted intermediaries. He received reports, signed orders, and dictated commands, but in shorter bursts, with increasing irritation. Physical suffering shortened his temper further. In December 1546, just weeks before his death, Henry ordered the execution of Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, once a loyal nobleman. The charges were political, vague, and likely exaggerated. Surrey was beheaded on January 19, 1547. His father, the Duke of Norfolk, was also sentenced to die, but the king's own death intervened before the sentence could be carried out. Henry's last months were marked by attempts to secure succession. He named a regency council to guide his son, Edward VI, and dictated the terms of his will. The will emphasized religious control, dynastic loyalty, and punishments for disobedience. Even in death, he attempted to govern the future. He spoke rarely. When he did, attendants noted repetition, fixation, and signs of mental fatigue. No final confession or public reckoning was recorded. He refused to see priests for last rites until hours before death. When they came, it was said he gave only brief acknowledgement. His focus was not spiritual, only on securing what remained of his control. He died on January 28, 1547, at the age of 55. Cause of death was likely a combination of infection, organ failure, and complications from obesity and untreated wounds. Witnesses described the moment as quiet. He slipped into unconsciousness and never awoke. Henry VIII had ordered thousands of deaths, reshaped the English church, and altered the nation's legal fabric. In the end, he died surrounded by silence, locked in his chamber, with a decaying body and an empire on the edge of new crisis. Richard Roose's name was never mentioned again, but the precedent that had consumed him lived on, etched into a reign that punished loyalty and mistake alike. Henry VIII died on a winter morning. Power was immediately contested. Henry VIII died with a detailed will, a designated heir, and a regency council to ensure stability. Within months, that structure began to fracture. His only surviving son, Edward VI, was just 9 years old when crowned. The kingdom fell into the hands of appointed protectors, noblemen who had pledged to govern jointly. In practice, power consolidated quickly under Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. He declared himself Lord Protector and sidelined rivals. The boy king had a crown, but no authority. Henry's legal and religious legacy immediately came under revision. The very laws he had imposed, rigid, brutal, and tailored to his own control, began to unravel. The new government accelerated Protestant reforms. Churches were stripped of imagery. The Latin Mass was replaced with English services. Those who had suffered under Henry's religious rigidity now pushed change in the opposite direction. Executions continued, but not for the same crimes. The boiling statute that had killed Richard Roose was quietly repealed in 1547, the same year Henry died. The method was never used again. The idea that Parliament could invent punishments for individual cases began to lose favour. Even royalists questioned whether unchecked sovereignty was sustainable. The Regency Council splintered. Somerset was overthrown in 1549 and later executed. His successor, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, ruled with calculated ambition. He arranged for his son to marry Lady Jane Grey, installing her briefly as queen after Edward's death in 1553. That coup failed. Jane was deposed by Mary I and executed. Public unrest simmered throughout the transition. Rebellions broke out over land, religion, and hunger. The common people, who had watched kings and nobles die in palaces and courts, saw little benefit from the changes. The machinery of fear had shifted hands, not vanished. The control Henry built did not survive him. What remained was a bitter memory of executions carried out without trial, laws made for vengeance, and a throne that consumed friend and servant alike. The kingdom moved on, but the power that had boiled a cook alive dissolved within a year of the king's death. The historical record of Henry VIII began to evolve immediately. Historians have long debated the significance of Richard Roose's case and what it reveals about Henry VIII's rule. In contemporary accounts, Roose was either ignored or treated as a footnote, an unfortunate figure consumed by circumstance. But modern scholarship views his execution as a key moment in the expansion of royal authority and the collapse of legal norms. Some legal historians identify the act of poisoning, 1531, as a direct challenge to the foundations of English common law. It bypassed the jury system, imposed retroactive punishment, and introduced a new, unusually cruel method of execution. Scholars argue this act illustrates how Tudor monarchy could use Parliament as a tool, not for general governance, but for targeted punishment. Political analysts note that the Roose case came at a pivotal moment, just as Henry was beginning to clash with the Catholic Church. By using a domestic crime to assert new forms of control, the king was preparing the legal foundation for greater religious and political shifts. Others focus on Henry's personal style of leadership. The response to the poisoning, swift, disproportionate, and symbolic, reflected a growing paranoia. Historians such as G.R. Elton and Geoffrey Elton have described Henry as a king increasingly dependent on spectacle, fear, and centralized decision-making. Roose's fate fits that model. Psychological interpretations exist as well. Some scholars interpret Henry's behavior in later years, especially in cases like Roose's and Anne Boleyn's, as indicators of an unstable, perhaps deteriorating mind, influenced by pain, isolation, and delusion. These readings remain controversial, relying heavily on inference rather than direct evidence. More recent academic work on Tudor law places the Roose case within a broader context of state violence. It was not an anomaly, but part of a pattern in which personal loyalty was enforced through terror. Boiling may have been rare, but the principle it represented, punishment by decree, became a feature of the regime. What was once seen as a single grisly event is now recognized as a turning point in English legal history. Modern historians continue to debate the long-term effects of Henry VIII's rule. Richard Roose left behind no writings, no family records, no legacy beyond the way he died. But his execution marked a pivotal shift in English governance, where law ceased to be a fixed structure and became a weapon, molded to suit the needs of absolute power. The 1531 Act that condemned him created a legal precedent. A man could be executed without trial if the king and parliament willed it. That principle, once introduced, did not disappear with Roose. It reappeared in bills of attainder, secret trials, and religious purges for decades to come. The idea that political stability could justify bypassing legal norms became embedded in Tudor practice. What Roose's case exposed, without intent, was how fragile the boundary was between crime and treason. One cook's act, whether accident or design, was treated as a threat to the entire state. His punishment was not meant to correct, but to terrify. The impact of his death echoed into the structures of English law. Future monarchs inherited both the power and the precedent. Elizabeth I would later refine royal control into more stable bureaucracies. The Stuart kings would push it further and eventually face civil war over it. Boiling as punishment was abolished within a generation. But its symbolism, state violence made public and personal, remained embedded in memory. It served as a warning. The line between loyalty and destruction was thin and easily redrawn. In modern legal history, the Roose case is studied not for its gore, but for what it revealed: that unchecked power does not need grand causes or famous victims. It can turn an ordinary kitchen into a battlefield. It can turn a mistake or an allegation into an execution. Roose was forgotten by most, but the structure that killed him survived, evolved, and shaped the course of a kingdom. His name disappeared. The mechanism that destroyed him did not.